All right. So building up to this point, we have discussed logbooks and the importance of logbooks. Today, as we're moving along in the maintenance curriculum, we're going to go over checklist because checklists are important for any aspect of aviation, whether it's manned or unmanned, whether it's the flight or the repair. Checklists are there because what we're doing is such a unique area, and it's dealing with an object being in the sky that could fall out of the sky. That it's important that we're sure that we're always doing what we need to do, and we've done everything to get to that point. Um, so I'm going to give you some time here in a minute to research checklists to fuel our discussion. If you're here in class, then of course our discussion will happen here. If you're not, you'll have a discussion post to reply to. But I'm also throwing an assignment up on Schoology for you to upload your checklist. Really, you won't be uploading your checklist since we create our checklist in Google Drive. You'll just be sharing that with me. Um, so let me see here. Okay, so I hope this is sharing the right screen. Um, Let me move my stuff around. So you'll go to the logbook you created, and up here, there's a purple button that says send. On mine, it's purple. It says send. Send via email or link. I would just do the email. You're going to email that to me, BHERRING at fortsmithschools.org. And since it's titled as your logbook, it'll say Grant's logbook or Steve's logbook or Susan's logbook, whatever is in there. And you can just leave it with I invite you to fill out a form. Make sure you include form in the email, and then send it to me. Oh, I did .org instead of .org. And it sends to me, and then I can go through, I can see it and grade it. And here on out, that gives me the ability to go in and check your logbooks, hopefully. So I can go through and see your experience as we're going through class. So that being said, I'm going to give you a few minutes to research checklist so we can start discussing that. Okay, so what have y'all gathered on checklists so far?
Make sure your batteries are charged.
Okay, checklist help you make sure your batteries are charged. Okay, so what is a checklist? Just so we can go ahead and get that out there. What's a checklist?
Making sure everything's operational and everything's in order to fly, or the conditions are in order to be flown in.
Okay, so it's a list of items that you want to observe to make sure that everything is in a safe and proper condition for flight, right? Or to complete the task, because you can use checklist for anything in your daily life. Um, so why are checklists important?
Make sure you're not forgetting anything.
Make sure you're not forgetting anything. Um, really sure how to phrase the question I'm wanting to ask right now. Um, so in most stuff that we do in day-to-day lives, whether it's at school or just at home chilling, or whether we're at our job, we don't typically always have a checklist. So why would it be important for us to have a checklist for this type of job? Jesse, any thoughts?
Could you repeat the question?
So since we don't typically use checklists all the time in our day-to-day lives, even while we're at work, why would it be important for us to have a checklist for this type of job?
To ensure that when we do go in, do go into the field and do work, we know that our drone is prepared and ready to do the work.
Okay. But I mean, any type of job that we're in, we're going to want to make sure our stuff's ready, but we don't typically use checklists. Why is this any different?
Because we need to record our data because the FAA might want to investigate. I don't know other than that.
Okay. So building a habit of using a checklist, kind of where you're going at with that is building a habit of using a checklist, um, shows that you're using a systematic method to ensure safety for what you're doing, because this isn't just something where you can just stop and everything pauses right where it's at. If something goes wrong, then something's falling out of the sky and hitting something or someone somewhere. So we've got to make sure that we've got safety in mind at all times for what we're doing. Um, but also, there's a lot of steps involved when it comes to flying something, and we want to make sure we've got all those processes covered to make sure things go right. In the basest form with what we're doing with electronic drones, the flight phases are going to be fairly simple because most of our stuff is fixed except for the rotors or the propellers. And there's not really anything else that we've got to worry about during the flight phases. But if we were to start jumping into alternative fuel methods for our drones, using gas two-stroke engine motors or hydrogen cell motors, there's a lot of other things that we'll have to start monitoring and considering when we fly that. If it's got retractable landing gear, that's going to be something else we've got to throw in there. Um, so with that, having the checklist, so we've got the same system, same flow that we do every time, keeps us accountable for what we're doing, and it makes sure we're not forgetting any steps. Um, one of the biggest reasons that there's accidents in the aviation, or there's incidents in the aviation community, is from checklist failure, pilot error, for not adhering to the checklist. In the manned aviation world, checklists are put out by the manufacturers of the plane, and sometimes the FAA will come through and say, "Hey, you need to add this or revise this," or there tends to be a trend of incidents, and that's when a checklist might get changed. In the unmanned world, and pretty much our DJI quadcopter assortment of drones, just the general quadcopter drones, there's not really a lot of a checklist that gets put out by the manufacturer, other than just basic safety stuff like make sure you're not flying over people, stuff like that. It just kind of echoes regulations versus safety. Um, but if you're up in an airplane and you're going through your checklist to make sure you've got everything situated for flight, and if something distracts you, or you get interrupted from that checklist, whether ATC is calling you on the radio or something, that's when incidents start to occur, because you get interrupted and you don't go back to the right spot, and so you end up skipping stuff. Also, if we try to do checklists from memory, I mean, once you do something so many times, it's repetitive. It seems commonplace, seems second nature. Um, but at that point where we just try to do everything from memory, is typically where we'll skip over something small and simple, that could lead to something big and catastrophic later. Um, so so having the actual checklist and verifying that you're utilizing the checklist is very important. Um, in commercial aviation, they get to a point where they do what are called flows, where they're flowing through the checklist. They're not actually using the checklist. They're just doing a flow of their tasks that would be on the checklist, to get it done quick and easy. but then after they do their flow, they come back and they do the physical checklist. The way that checklists are done, if we're going to be doing some kind of group activity, or if you're going to have a couple people like a pilot, a remote pilot in command, and then a person manipulating controls, checklists should be done by both of those people, similar to the way that a captain and a first officer would do in an airplane. And that is done by a challenge and response method. So if the first item on your checklist is, let me see. Well, let's just say you're at a point in your checklist and the checklist item reads battery installed. The person that's not controlling the airplane would read that item and say battery installed. The person that is controlling the airplane would say check or battery installed to affirm that. Something kind of like that. So it's a challenge. The person not flying is challenging the person flying. The person flying is responding. So that's kind of how we're going to do our operations when we get out here flying the 450s, the Heroes, and any other flight that we do. It's going to be a challenge response type thing. So what are the different sections that we would find on a checklist, whether it's for manned or unmanned aviation?
Probably maintenance, be its own section.
Yeah, so a maintenance checklist would be its own thing, to make sure everything's put back together and repaired correctly.
I just mean stuff like, making sure your props aren't damaged and your updates are all completed, batteries are in good condition.
Yeah, those would be items you would find. Typically, your checklist is going to be broken down into sections, though, to group common things together, sort of.
That's what I'm saying, would not be its own section.
Checking to make sure your props and stuff aren't dinged up. That would be in a section.
But props, batteries, updates.
Okay, so it's your checklist is pretty much going to go along with the phases that you're going to be going through. So it's not going to break things down into individual components so much.
So it would be like pre-flight assessment, post-flight assessment.
Yeah, something like that, and it's going to try to go to where it's a flow, so you're not jumping here and there all over the place on the drone. It's going to be pretty. No, it's just pretty much going to flow around the drone and through the processes instead of being all here and there. You want it to seem natural, so it's going to try to flow natural. But did anybody find those phases that we might have, those sections we might have in the checklist? DeAndre, you got anything? No. Jesse, got anything?
Alert from updates available.
Oops. Okay, so what if we're going to go out and fly a drone tomorrow? What would we do today?
Check the weather.
We check the weather. So what is that part of?
I don't know, all I can think of is pre-flight.
Okay, so yeah, pre-flight is part of it. When so like in the manned aviation world, there's a lot more phases to a checklist than the unmanned world. If I'm going to be flying tomorrow, I'm going to start planning today. I've got my planning checklist, my mission planning checklist, which is part of pre-flight. And then whenever I get out to the airport, I'm going to double check all that stuff that I checked yesterday, make sure it's all set and good. Then I'm going to do my pre-flight checklist where I walk around the entire airplane, checking to make sure it's got all the bolts and wires and cotter pins it's supposed to have. Make sure there's no dings and dents anywhere. Check that whole thing out on the outside. Then I'm going to get inside the plane and check and make sure all the gauges are looking right, all the lights are working like they're supposed to, all the fuses are in. Then I'm going to get that airplane to where it's ready to go. Before I start the engine, I'm going to have a before engine start checklist. So I'm going to go through this checklist before I start the engine. Then it's going to go into the engine start checklist, and I go through the checklist so I get every step right in starting that engine. Then there'll be a pre-taxi checklist. So I'll go through that checklist before I even let the wheels move. While I'm taxiing, there might be a taxi checklist. If not, then there'll be a run-up checklist where I'm going to run up the engine to make sure everything's working right. All my instruments are indicating correctly, stuff like that. That's part of the before takeoff checklist. Then as I am rolling onto the runway after I've gotten my clearance to take the runway and depart from the airport to take off, I will go through the takeoff checklist. After I take off, I've got a climbing checklist where I'll go through and make sure everything's configured like it needs to while I'm climbing. After the climb, there's the cruise checklist. So I can make sure everything's set up so I'm getting the best efficiency out of my aircraft while I'm cruising. So I make sure I don't have the landing gear still down, creating drag. I've got my flaps up so I'm not creating more drag than I need. And I'm not running my engine too hot or too lean while we're going, so I get the best efficiency for the speed I'm wanting. As we're going through there, I'll have a so on the cruise, and I'll have a descent checklist that I'll go through before I even start to descend, and then I'll follow that through. Then there's the before landing checklist, landing checklist, and then there's a after landing / securing the aircraft checklist. And all that is usually found on a card that is in the airplane that is laminated front and back. But what might be some other stuff on a checklist? Since I'm talking about manned aviation, what might be some other stuff that would be important to have on a checklist? What might be some important sections?
On a man,
Yeah. Because a lot of what we do takes after the manned aviation world for how we do our stuff, because it's aviation. So what might be some other important sections?
did you say an in-flight checklist earlier?
Mhm. Yeah, cruise. Anything that I might want to have where I could quickly get to it and start going through it. Uh,
Like the engine checklist?
An engine checklist. Yeah. So we've got the normal operational checklist, and then we've got the non-normal phases checklist. But going towards the engine, we also have checklist for malfunctions and emergencies. So in my checklist, if I'm starting up my airplane and I see an engine fire, I can flip my checklist over to the back and there's an engine fire checklist. And it tells me step by step what I need to do real quick. If I have an engine fire, whether that's in flight or on the ground. For unusual or non-normal checklist, like if I'm taking off on a grass runway, I'm going to have a soft field checklist because that soft grass is going to be a lot different than a hard asphalt runway. Or if I'm trying to get up off of a short runway, I'm going to have a short field checklist to make sure I'm doing all the steps right there because it's going to be totally different. If we were dealing with a fixed wing drone, some of those things might come into consideration aside from the multi-rotor drones. So yeah, so any type of malfunction could be on a checklist. Definitely your main emergencies are going to be a checklist on a checklist. So you don't have to use memory recall when you're under a lot of stress. You can just flip over and find what you need and go from there. We'll kind of do the same thing with drones. We'll have our mission planning section, which could take place the day before, a couple of days before, or the morning of the flight that you're going to do. You'll have kind of your pre-flight walk around where you have an aircraft visual inspection to making sure everything looks okay. And that's going to flow into your pre-flight checklist or your before takeoff checklist. Then from there, we'll pretty much have a flight checklist since it's going to be pretty simple using what we're using because everything's pretty well fixed. And it's quad rotor. And then we'll have a kind of a before landing and then a post mission checklist or shutdown securing checklist. So we'll have 5 or 6 sections on a checklist. It could be like 30 or so items altogether. It could be a lot more items altogether. So what might be some? Okay, so we've gone over that. What are some items we're going to want to make sure is on our checklist? What are things that we want to make sure are good with our drone before we go? Let's just talk about the pre-flight. What do we want to make sure is good on our drone before we go?
Everything I said earlier, and make sure your controller or your
Okay, so what all did you say earlier? Let's
make sure
recap.
batteries are in good condition and charged.
Batteries are in good condition and charged.
Your props are in good condition.
Props are in good condition, no nicks or dings, cracks.
Your software's updated.
Software's updated.
Update while you're flying or something. Or, there might be a patch.
Make sure everything's updated before you take off. Make sure there's no cracks in the airframe. Okay. Make sure your gimbal's there. Make sure your camera's like it needs to be. Speaking of camera, what might we need to check before we fly?
SD card.
Make sure that it has an SD card. It sucks when you go out and fly for an hour taking pictures and video just to land and find out that you didn't have an SD card, so that hour was wasted and you don't have any pictures and video. It's happened on more than one occasion. And it could have been prevented had I used the checklist on those occasions. And we're going to make sure everything's charged up like it needs to be, stuff like that. What would be some items for our in-flight phase that we'd want to have on a checklist?
Make sure the GPS is good.
To make sure we have a GPS lock with enough satellites. What else we got? Jesse? Okay, are you paying attention or are you doing other stuff on your computer?
No.
Okay. Well, if you're not going to pay attention, you need to put your computer away. Okay, so what are some checklist items we want to have on our flight phase? I've done forgot what Grant said.
GPS.
Yeah, the GPS. Make sure we've got accurate GPS.
Make sure, I guess that'd be day before, 5 nautical miles.
Weather check. Yeah, you want to do it right before the flight. It'd be part of your pre-flight.
It is 5, isn't it? Or is it 3?
Your visibility is
Yeah.
3
3.
statute miles. Okay, how about right after we take off, right after we get it off the ground, what do we want to do?
Make sure the drone works and we can, use the full range of motion of it.
Okay, so we want to verify our control inputs, right? So we'll get up, make sure it's responsive to all inputs appropriately, make sure it goes forward, backward, left, right, yaw's left, yaw's right, climbs, descends appropriately, make sure our gimbal moves like it's supposed to. And then we're going to go out and fly, pretty much. If we had like landing gear or retractable landing gear, we'd probably throw in a before landing checklist to make sure that that stuff comes out like it's supposed to. Something we might want to do on our flight checklist right after we take off is make sure our return to home point is set for the right spot. Make sure we've got our return to home protocol set. So in case we lose transmission with the drone, whether that's video transmission or radio transmission, that the drone will respond appropriately in the environment we're in to safely land and not just crash or fly away. So then after that, we'll have a post-mission checklist. What might we have in the after landing or post-mission checklist?
Check again to make sure nothing's damaged.
Okay, probably the first thing will be to turn the battery off on the drone, turn the drone off. And then we'll turn the controller off. And then we'll double check, make sure there's not any damage. Make sure everything's turned off like it's supposed to be in the appropriate manner. Drone first, transmitter second, controller second, and then start storing stuff away. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there for today, and you can probably guess at what we're gonna do next time we're in class. So make sure you submit that logbook assignment. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, reach out to me, let me know.